us at the moment, and how can we rationalize the whole production and consumption system. So sustainable production and consumption is part of the solution. It is not necessarily continuing to produce. Look at the fisheries sector. I just talked about cereals, and food is not necessarily only cereals. You need to diversify to look at the whole system. 30 million tons of fish are discarded at sea every year. 30 million tons of fish. You know what they do? When they catch the fish, they select what the species that they want. The rest is called bycatch. And yet next door to where they are fishing, including in the coast of West Africa where I come from, that will throw the fish in the sea, while just next door people are starving. So is that rational? And how can we change the way we do business so as to get these 30 million, that's a lot of proteins, by the way. Okay? So that, again, we need to have a look at very, very seriously. Do you also know that up to 3 million tons of fish are used to feed fish for aquaculture? I'm not saying it is not good to do that, but there are, you know, in the fish has, there are herbivores and omnivores and carnivores. And some of the fish that we eat are carnivores, so they need fish. So can we use part of the fish that is discarded at sea, at least to feed the fish that we need for our aquaculture? Again, we need to look at the whole system and see where we can make some more rational solutions. One of the options that we also have to look at is, shall we continue to deplete the fresh water of the world? Or shall we have what we advocate in UNEP in terms of the green economy approach? Can we have a look at the wastewater? You know that agriculture is the single most important user of fresh water, up to 70%, 65% according to some statistics. The fresh water that is used at the moment in the world is used for agriculture. So there is scope for reuse of that. And we dump into nature every year 3 billion tons of wastewater. Every day, sorry, I said every year, every day, daily equivalent. And part of that goes to rivers, part of that goes to coastal areas, and part of that has now created, especially in the industrialized regions, but also more and more now in the developing world, we see deoxygenated coastal areas. They call them dead zones, where there is no oxygen anymore because of that waste that is being dumped into our system. And what does it do? It affects our production, our fish production, amongst other things. So by producing more cereals, we are actually destroying proteins. So can we have a look at that and reuse part of that wastewater? Not only it will reduce the consumption of fresh water, but also it will reduce the kind of pollution we are doing into our rivers, into our coastal areas. So again, let's look at the whole system rather than just looking at it sector by sector, because there will be no solution that will be coming from one single sector. It has to be more integrated. It has to. We can go on to many other issues. You know, water augmentation that needs to be done, etc., etc. I'll stop there. My conclusion is just to say, and I had long discussions with my friends in Africa, especially those that have promoted this CADA, what is the plan, the agriculture plan for Africa, which basically says we need to double the production and we need to double the land occupied for agriculture. And we say, how many Africas do we need? How many Africas do we have? How much land do we have to do that? Part of Africa is arid lands, so the only areas of expansion that you can have is basically the savannas and the forests of Central Africa. So is that solution? Or do you have other options to put on the table? And where is the water going to come from? Thank you.
tough questions from Ibrahim. I'm going to turn it over now to Julie Shapiro from the Keystone Center, who's been working on at least a piece of the systems elephant with some collaboratives actually in the U.S., but she's going to speak a little bit more, I think, to what the other speakers have mentioned is this need for really a systems perspective and view of engaging all the pieces of the elephant of this issue together. So good.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for the great comments and insights so far. At the kickoff of this session, Sarah talked a little bit about the Keystone Center, but I know many of you have joined since, so let me just spend one moment on that. The Keystone Center is a nonprofit based in the United States. We are independent mediators and facilitators working on issues in environment, energy, and health policy. We also have an education division, but along with Sarah, I work in the environment focus area of our science and public policy division. So we really try to serve as the neutrals, bringing together industry, nonprofits, government, academia, and other stakeholders to collaboratively forge solutions to various problems. And in my work in the environmental practice, I have focused primarily on agriculture work, although I have also worked in areas including landscape scale conservation, forestry, mining, and air quality. So what I'd like to do with my time here, and I'll try to keep it brief, is touch a little bit on some of the fundamentals for collaboration that I've learned over the course of working both in the agriculture arena but also in some of these other environmental arenas, and then use as a particular example some of the agriculture work that I've done in the United States to get at some of these areas of disagreement and see how some of these principles for collaboration might provide a path forward towards addressing them. So first, fundamentals for collaboration. Looking at the areas that lack consensus and also knowing how these were developed really through an assessment process of reaching out for individual responses and then synthesizing them rather than through a dialogue process, I think that they really provide a great platform to continue conversation and try to start bringing people together to first understand, are these really the areas of disagreement, to see if we can further press on the issues, perhaps even reframe the questions and identify some areas where there might be more agreement or consensus or shared interest than these questions as they're written now suggest. So to do that successfully, one principle is really that we need to engage the full suite of stakeholders who have an interest in these topic areas. I know this can be an uncomfortable combination sometimes to bring to a table. It's not always easy to get different stakeholders to sit down with some who might be unknown to them or perhaps even adversaries in other contexts. But in order to address these problems, and I think my fellow panelists have already touched on how complex they are, we really need that full suite of perspectives to understand the issues and to identify what might work. There's a saying that I usually use with my participants, which is to go fast, go alone, but to go far, go together. And so I think it's noteworthy that collaboration can be less expedient in the short term, but much more durable in the long term. And I'm thinking of a session yesterday that I attended on soils, and there was an example given of an international legal framework for desertification that has been kind of volleyed back and forth in the EU, and someone made the comment that part of the reason for its failure is that farming groups have lobbied against it. And so to me, as someone who focuses on collaboration, the question is, can we bring those farmer lobbying groups in to build the solution that would be acceptable rather than getting stuck in that stalemate? So bringing together the stakeholders offers the opportunity to understand different perspectives, perhaps remove some of the prejudices that exist, and to build the relationships and trust that might create more enduring solutions. The second principle is to really focus on outcomes and interests. A lot of the framing of these questions or areas lacking consensus is really talking about hows. It's talking about how to use technology, how to use agrobiodiversity, how to engage corporations. But I think that the place to start is to understand the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And generally speaking, I found in my work with agriculture stakeholders, there is some agreement that we are trying to produce food to feed the world in the context of sustainable systems that support the environment as well as the people who are producing food and the other players in that full supply chain. So starting with the outcomes and the objectives and focusing on that can often open up space to talk about the hows in a different way and provide perhaps some creative opportunities and innovations that we don't necessarily see when we just frame questions in binary means. A third principle is to ground conversations in good science and shared discovery. And a lot of the work we do at the Keystone Center is in trying to identify where facts are agreed upon, trying to identify knowledge gaps, and trying to build agreement where none currently exists on the most important information that is needed to bring to bear on the policy decisions that we're trying to make. A fourth principle or fundamental for collaboration is to make progress on what's possible. There are so many aspects to the problems of food security and biodiversity in agriculture that it doesn't make sense to start with the one that is the most intractable or that is likely to be the hardest to get people to work on together. We often find that by starting with some of the lower hanging fruit, you can open up the relationships and the trust that would be needed to tackle those bigger problems later on. So again, with those four fundamentals, engaging a full suite of stakeholders, focusing on outcomes and interests, grounding conversations in good science, and shared discovery, and making progress on what's possible, I think we can take a look at these questions and then perhaps see them in a new light, which is to say, how can we answer them through a collaborative framework that can open up new space and perhaps reframe the questions. So I want to give you just a more specific example of how this has worked in a project in the United States that's called Field to Market, the Keystone Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture. This is a collaborative stakeholder group that formed 6 years ago with an awareness that sustainability in agriculture was becoming a really big buzzword, that individual stakeholders were starting to take strides on their own to try to frame the questions and forge solutions, but a recognition that having a collaborative approach that everyone bought into might be a better way to go. And so the stakeholder group has grown to about 50 organizations that represent everyone from producers to agribusinesses, food and retail companies, conservation organizations, universities, and some of the agricultural extension and government extension folks within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The group focuses on commodity agriculture, and so we have producer organizations that include the corn growers and soybean growers, and then everyone up the supply chain that use those and other major commodities in the U.S. The group is trying to identify supply chain strategies to define, measure, and promote continuous improvement in agriculture, and it's taking a definition of sustainability that encompasses the three pillars often cited in other contexts as well, economic, social, and environmental. And it's really focusing on developing and implementing outcomes and science-based metrics and tools. And so it has everything from an online calculator for individual growers to understand their practices in sustainability, as well as measurement approaches to understand the full, or the larger picture of sustainability for agriculture in the United States. So some of the big ideas that Field to Market has embraced that kind of parallel some of the previous comments I made on the fundamentals of collaboration. One is in engaging the full supply chain. We found that prior to this effort, producers were often not at the table in conversations on agriculture. That's essential. And bringing them together with the other players I've mentioned is really the way to create those lasting solutions. There's a question up here about what roles should corporations have in our food systems. Well, they certainly already play a very fundamental role in providing technology, in providing the links in the supply chain that deliver food to consumers. But they can't solve problems on their own, and we also cannot solve them in the absence of the corporate players. And so that's how I would answer that question. And again, urge collaboration with those players, again, even if it's an uncomfortable proposition at first. Field to Market has also focused on commodity crops, and this was a choice made because in the United States, a vast majority of acreage is used to produce commodities. And commodities have different issues than specialty crops. They are being produced in large farms in the US as well as small farms, and there are different issues that come up with different crops, different geographies, different contexts. So to the question of small-scale farming or large-scale farming, I think a lesson to be taken from Field to Market is that it depends. I think we've already heard that at this table, but recognizing the food that or the agriculture products that you're interested in and focusing on the best mechanisms to address that in the right context is an important principle for Field to Market. And again, I think it pushes us out of the binary debate. It's important, I think, again, just to not leave players out of the conversation. So we do have large-scale farming, we do have small-scale farming, we have subsistence. So, so the question is framed, I think, belies the fact that that we have it all already, and so to take one focus or another really leaves out a big portion of our stakeholders. Another big idea from the Field to Market work we've done is really around science and outcomes-based measures. I mentioned earlier the need to focus on objectives, and I think this really speaks to the questions around technology and GMOs. This group came together and asked the question, what are the indicators for sustainability that we want to impact? And the indicators weren't technology and GMOs, the indicators are energy, land use, water quality and water use, soils, greenhouse gas emissions, economic viability, productivity. If we can set the targets on those indicators and figure out how to measure against them and then relate practices back to those outcomes, that is a way to break through some of these questions, I think, and identify the hows that get you to the whats that are most desired. And then finally, the other big idea that I would cite from Field to Market is in looking at metrics for sustainability. So once you've identified those indicators and those outcomes of interest, you need to be able to measure if you're going to be able to manage. And you need to be able to measure at the large scale so that you know what direction the needle is moving. And you also need to be able to translate those measurements into smaller scale tools that can honor the fact that it's really individual actions on fields and farms that are contributing to that broader landscape. So linking up systems of measurement to understand what's happening and also share information across the full supply chain and suite of stakeholders is really fundamental. The last thing I'll say from Field to Market is that in the context of biodiversity, we've had a lot of great discussions around what the right indicators are for biodiversity in the United States and how to measure them. Likely those are different answers than you would ask, or that you would get if you ask the same question in different places. And in particular, within the US, we have a pretty mature agricultural landscape. Most of the land that's been converted or that is going to be converted has been converted, and so questions of land sharing versus land sparing and agrobiodiversity are going to take different forms than they will in the Amazon or in Africa, where you might be considering conversion. So that brings us back to the need for context, the need to understand the relationship between practices and outcomes. So I'll just conclude by saying that, again, many of these areas that are lacking consensus could potentially be reframed to move past binary framings, to better recognize and address context, to reveal the common interests and the common objectives, and to identify opportunities for flexibility. And that to do all of this, we really need to engage that full suite of stakeholders.
Okay, great. Thank you, Julie. And thanks to all the panelists. I think some great themes are starting to emerge, again, across what's a fairly diverse set of perspectives sitting at the table. Really this idea of a systems perspective, of really needing to look at everything that's happening and connect those dots is really important. Also, I got a sense from each of you in speaking that it's important to work with the systems we have. And so, from Ibrahim's urging to look at the waste that's currently in the systems and how do we address that better and use that to the advantage of meeting this really unique and global challenge of increasing food production while preserving the environment. Working with farmers where they are today, small, big, wherever they are, is really important. Looking at the landscapes and that mosaic as it is today, and figuring out the goals moving forward. And as Julie just said, sort of identifying the goals, and then Andrea, I think you hit a lot on, what are the ground rules then for that systems conversation? What are the principles that need to be put in place? What are the rules of the road for engaging those conversations, so that those goals are identified early on, and everybody's working as much as possible towards a common set of objectives and expectations going forward. I did sort of give a teaser that I did want to take advantage of the panel that we have here today, and I think it's at these points in these conversations where people can start to sort of get a little sleepy-eyed from all of the information that's been flowing your way, and take a personal moment. And I've asked each of the speakers just to think a little bit about what has brought them to this work, and why they're passionate about that. And that's really twofold. One is I think it's we forget to do that sometimes in these conversations, and it can actually illuminate a lot of what's important about these conversations, because we